Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Tuesday, March 17th, 2026. Cultural competence and the culture of medicine. The phrase cultural competence arises often in discussions about improving medical education and healthcare in the United States. It is usually used to refer to a body of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors in which physicians ought to be trained if they are to deliver sensitive, empathetic, humanistic care that is respectful of patients, involves effective, patient-centered communication, and responds to patients' psychosocial issues and needs. It is commendable that the authors who address these attributes think of them as professional abilities that can be taught and implemented in clinical training, rather than primarily as virtues associated with moral character. Unfortunately, such authors almost invariably fail to recognize that their own culture also merits enlightened examination, for it is far from a neutral background against which other cultures may be measured. Cultural competence is most often invoked in relation to the increasingly diverse, multicultural composition of U.S. society and the challenges of caring for patients of Black, Hispanic, or to a lesser extent, Asian origin. The term is applied particularly to settings in which are conspicuous ethnic, racial, and economic disparities in the quality of and access to health care. Strikingly, the concept does not usually encompass the distinctive cultural attributes of U.S. society that shape the attitudes and values of the country's inhabitants. Healthcare professionals and patients alike, there is, for example, a detectable Americanness in the optimistic belief in medical science and technology, in their limitless progress and promise, their vigorous application, and their power to overcome disease that pervades our society. And is pronounced in medical training. If discussions of cultural competence ignore U.S. culture, they also neglect what psychiatrist and medical anthropologist Arthur Kleinen calls the culture of biomedicine and its effects on physicians trained in modern Western medicine. And it affects on physicians trained in modern Western medicine. It may be argued, for example, that even the scientific concepts and language through which biomedical knowledge is conveyed, such as the notions of helper cells and killer cells in immunology, are culturally shaped. Because of Kleinman's work in this area, writer Anne Fadiman sought his opinion on the gulf between the beliefs held by the parents of the gravely ill Hmong child and the diagnostic conviction of the American physicians who cared for her. The parents understood their daughter's malady in terms of soul loss caused by a spirit, and they believed it should be treated with Hmong herbal medicines, the ceremonial administrations of traditional practitioner, and sacrificing of animals. The doctors believed the girl had severe epilepsy that should be treated with a continuous regime of strong anticonvulsant drugs. Questioned about the tragedy that resulted, Kleinman remarked on the physicians' obliviousness in their immersion in the culture of their profession. As powerful an influence as the culture of the Hmong patient and her family is on this case, the culture of biomedicine is equally powerful. If you can't see that your own culture has its own set of interests, emotions, and biases, how can you expect to deal successfully with someone else's culture? In addition to failing to acknowledge the underlying values and assumptions of biomedicine that patients may not share, most considerations of cultural competence neither identify nor explore the culture of medical training grounds. U.S. medical educators keep a careful annual count of the numbers of faculty members, of applicants for admission, and enrolled students. Because of their interest in increasing the portion of women and members of underrepresented minority groups in their student body, they pay special attention to these subgroups. Nevertheless, their reports do not usually analyze the effects of the composition of the student body and the faculty on the value system of the medical school, its cultural ambiance, and the implicit and explicit attitudinal messages that the educational process transmits. The significance of the cultural environment of the medical school of such phenomena as the continuous burgeoning of the member of a full-time faculty members, an increase and the decrease in the number who actually teach medical students, the escalating rate of the turnover among medical school deans, the steady increase in the number of female students, and the intractably slow growth in the number of minority students remains largely unexamined. Given the lack of attention to these aspects of culture, it is not surprising that no systematic consideration has been given to the ways in which changes in the economic, political, and ideological outlook on the larger American scene, and in the healthcare system in particular, may affect the attitudes and values with which students undertake medical studies, including their reasons for pursuing a medical career and their conceptions of what it will be like to be a doctor. Medical educators, in other words, do not apply to the concept of cultural competence to furthering their own understanding of the students they teach or the milieu in which they convey attitudes, values, and behavioral integral to patient care. The recognition of these blind spots open up the question of how a more broad-gauged cultural competence that is professionally relevant and functional can be taught effectively enough to be put into practice. Such training would entail more than raising consciousness about the importance of cultural patterns and intercultural differences. Improving communication skills or role modeling interactions with patients. Of fundamental importance would be the systematic acquisition of in-depth knowledge and understanding of at least one society other than one's own. This sort of learning experience, at once cognitive and attitudinal, is essential to opening up cultural perspectives and overcoming provincialism by helping one to see more clearly the characteristics of one's own society and culture, and heightened one's appreciation of commonalities and differences among cultures. It may also enhance physicians' attunement to the cultural nuances of their interactions. With patients and their families, and it may help them to acknowledge their occasional need for intermediaries to assist them in deciphering aspects of these relationships. But at what stage in the training of medical students could such cosmopolitan education take place? Is there any space for it in the rapidly paced, biomedically crammed course of learning where they undergo? Who on the faculty would be qualified to teach it? Would physicians in training consider it medically relevant and vital enough to be motivated to learn what it has to teach them? Or would such education be more appropriately accomplished during their college years? If so, should achieving some degree of cultural competence in this way be a precondition for admission to medical school? Prerequisite to any attempt to heighten medical students' consciousness of the cultural components of the medicine they learn, and the context in which they are taught to be doctors, is increasing the awareness among the faculty members of medical schools of these dimensions of their educational process and their own relationship to them. With some input from medical anthropologists, sociologists, and historians, they might build into the curriculum learning experiences conducive to insights about the pattern of medical culture, including the culture of the medical school, and the subcultural attributes of various medical specialties that are implicitly conveyed to students. Such medical cultural issues reflect a larger set of questions with which U.S. medical educators have grappled for almost a century, namely how medical schools can augment their efforts to teach what they have variously called the social, psychosocial, humanistic, behavioral, non-biomedical, and ethical components of health and illness. Seen from this vantage point, cultural competence is old wine in new bottles. The vocabulary now in vogue for describing one of the most persistent problems in medical education. English or Spanish? For some Latino parents, it's not so simple. There was a lot of self-hate around speaking Spanish growing up, one Latina mom tells Today.com. Now she hopes her son will learn the language. Priscilla Blossom, a Nicaraguan and Mexican American, grew up speaking Spanish, but felt pressured to assimilate and would sometimes only communicate in English. Now as a mom, she worries that her son, who only speaks English, is missing out on his heritage. It's common for Latino Americans to not be fluent in Spanish. According to the Pew Research Center, 24% of all Latino American adults say they can only carry on a conversation in Spanish a little or not at all. And 54% of non-Spanish speaking Latino Americans say they've been shamed by other Latinos for not speaking Spanish. I grew up in Miami. Blossom, 39, tells Today.com. I'd often go to stores or restaurants where no one spoke English. Spanish was everywhere. So while I learned it from my family, it was frankly almost a matter of survival to speak Spanish. Still, Blossom says at times she would refuse to speak Spanish and would only answer her mother in English. There are just some things, some thoughts, feelings, and sentiments that simply don't fully translate, and it makes me sad to think he may never fully understand them. Priscilla Blossom on why she wants her son to learn Spanish. Despite living in a predominantly Latinx area, there's a lot of self-hate toward Latinidad and toward speaking Spanish, adds Blossom, who's now 39. Kids would see it as lesser than and had a desire to be more American, meaning more white. That influenced me a lot and prevented me from learning even more Spanish. Multiple studies, including research from the Center for Comparative Immigration, studies at the University of California, San Diego, show that the pressure for Latino immigrant families to assimilate to the U.S. culture leads to a decline in Spanish fluency over time. Esteban Thauma, who teaches Spanish for Babbel Live, a language learning platform, says it's important to emphasize that language is not the main thing that makes you part of the Latino community. We are not bound by language, Thauma tells Today.com. I think the best thing we can do is emphasize that notion that we do share a history of colonization. We do share a lot of other elements that can help us find a way to unite and communicate in a better way, whether we speak the same language or not. Still, Thauma believes that learning Spanish allows you to see the world with new eyes. It can expand your perception, and also help you understand where your parents or grandparents came from. He adds, it gives you new tools to connect with those parts of your identity. Blossom says she's always been fluent in Spanish, but says it's been a little choppy and not as good these days. When her 9-year-old son was 2, her family moved from Miami to Denver, Colorado. And Blossom says she now has virtually no one to speak with in Spanish. The mom had hoped to raise her son to be bilingual too, but the move has made it difficult. I had no support system and didn't know anyone in town who spoke Spanish, she says. His preschool was mostly full of white children and teachers, and no one spoke Spanish there either. Priscilla Blossom says she's afraid her 9-year-old son is missing out on the ability to better learn his culture because he doesn't speak Spanish. Blossom's son would attend after-school Spanish lessons once in a while when a school offered it. She says, but sadly, he only knows a few words and phrases. It's frustrating because I know if I made time, maybe I could show him more, Blossom says. But as a busy working parent, it's not always possible. While learning Spanish would expand future career opportunities for her son and make it easier for him to travel as an adult, she says she really wants him to learn so he can better communicate with his family. I would love for him to get to connect with the Spanish-only speaking family members he has in Nicaragua he has yet to meet. She says there are just some things, some thoughts, feelings, and sentiments that simply don't fully translate, and it makes me sad that he may never fully understand them. Toma says that it's common to feel frustrated when learning or trying to teach a child another language, especially when someone is feeling shame or inadequate for not being able to speak the language of their heritage. The first step is to try to be a little more immersed, while knowing that knowing the language does not inflict on your own identity and your ability to form a community, he says. Blossom says she didn't realize how important understanding and speaking Spanish was until she moved away from her hometown. It's more a point to pride these days, she says. A full circle moment when she thinks back on the pressure to speak English as a child in order to assimilate. I hope that my son continues to try and learn that he can feel more connected to his identity as someone who is at least part Latino, Blossom says. To understand where his family came from, all the sacrifices grandparents made to get him where he is. And he learns that it's all something to be proud of and not shamed for, as some would have us believe. Federal judge halts RFK Jr.'s changes to children's vaccine policies. A federal judge in Boston blocked changes to U.S. vaccine policies championed by Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. A federal judge Monday dealt a major blow to the Trump administration's efforts to overhaul the nation's vaccine policies, including the controversial decision to slash the number of federally recommended vaccinations for children. U.S. District Court Judge Brian Murphy in Boston put a hold on the decisions made by the influential Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Vaccine Advisory Committee ruling that Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had improperly replaced the entire committee. The decision was hailed by the American Academy of Pediatrics and other leading health groups that brought the lawsuit, as well as infectious disease experts around the country. Today's ruling is a historic and welcome outcome for children, communities, and pediatricians everywhere, said Andrew Rayson, the Pediatric Academy's president. The administration's plans to appeal the decision, according to the Department of Health and Human Services spokesman Andrew Nixon, HHS looks forward to this judge's decision. Being overturned just like his other attempts to keep the Trump administration from governing. Nixon wrote in an email to NPR. Nixon confirmed, however, that the ruling had forced the CDC Vaccine Committee, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, to postpone a meeting that was planned for Wednesday and Thursday. The committee was expected to raise new questions about the COVID-19 vaccines and possibly revamp how federal vaccine policies are formulated. The judge ruled that Kennedy and his committee had made arbitrary and capricious decisions, ignoring a long-used, well-regarded scientific process. For developing vaccine policies. He wrote in his ruling, "The government has disregarded those methods and thereby undermined the integrity of its actions." The ACIP, whose members Kennedy fired and replaced, largely with new members who also criticized vaccines, had issued a series of contentious recommendations, including a recommendation that all babies get vaccinated against hepatitis B at birth. The judge's ruling says the appointment of 13 committee members appointed by Kennedy since June 2025, when the previous members were fired. Administration lawyers have argued that the changes also were the result of different interpretations of vaccine data. This is a significant victory for public health. Evidence-based medicine, the rule of law, and the American people. Richard Hughes, a lawyer for the plaintiffs, told reporters after the ruling.